in general, the following advice works well. No gluten, no dairy, no nightshade vegetables. We're going to kind of recap a topic that is of great interest to many individuals, and that is just how to deal with fatigue. We're going to talk a little bit about, how prevalent fatigue is, some of the things that I look for in terms of, symptoms, and then really the key things will be testing, therapies, primarily your diet and lifestyle, as well as supplement and medication therapies. That's how I basically try to improve it and basically get to the point where you're energetic throughout the day. Okay, so if you are fatigued, one thing to recognize is this: you're not alone. Pictorial of a recent study. So this study right here, it used data from about 101 patients that were enrolled in a large commercial insurance carrier. And these were all the claims made for either myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue syndrome. Both these are the same diagnosis. And what they saw was that it is really, really prevalent. At any time, about 1% to 2% of the population is suffering from extreme fatigue, which is pretty significant. And as you can see over here, it affects females more than males in general, but it also has a trend. You see this like a trend that seems to grow upwards with females once they hit about their 40s and then kind of levels off and stays pretty stable. It's the same somewhat for guys, but to a lesser degree. But then you notice there's a peak right around the late 60s or so. So there's a peak around 40, and then it kind of levels off, then another peak around 60s. And so it's just, the key thing to recognize is that it's definitely something that a lot of people deal with. When we think about fatigue, there are many things that can occur. Some of the most common causes that we like to think about in functional medicine are due to food sensitivities, which is why diet is so important. And the main things that I always try to hammer out to patients are the following: gluten, dairy, staying away from nitrates, food colorings. These things can all cause allergies, which can manifest as fatigue, inflammation. And, I'm always really key about getting patients' CRP down, which, in many cases is secondary to their diet. But high levels of inflammation can contribute to some of these cytokines, which in turn can cause a overextension of the immune system, which can manifest as fatigue. Mitochondrial dysfunction. And we always talk about NAD, L-carnitine. Things that can optimize your mitochondria are going to improve your body's response to fatigue. So that's why optimizing vitamins and utilizing certain minerals are going to be a big deal. And something as simple as just low blood pressure can cause fatigue. And one thing I've noticed, I notice this a lot with my patients who are ultra healthy that already are following a really strict diet. They won't have enough salt in their diet. When you're eating things that are not processed, right, they don't tend to include a lot of salt. So salting your food can be a big deal. The other thing that is important is you need to rule out any sort of other conditions before you start thinking about lab values. So, and this is not so much a concern for the vast majority of my patients, because typically we find out about these, but there's a ton of conditions that can also contribute to fatigue: Cushing's syndrome, diabetes, lupus, iron overload, HIV, multiple sclerosis, narcolepsy. All of these things by themselves can contribute. And what I found, though, is generally, though, doing the interventions that I recommend, which, as we talked about, consistent lab testing, diet and exercise optimization, and optimization of supplements as well as medications, seem to improve them regardless of the cause. So that's kind of interesting. And then the other thing that is important is there is a diagnosis set for chronic fatigue syndrome. It's a little bit on the vague side, but it is important to kind of recognize these symptoms because, some of us may not think we have fatigue, but when you look at it on its head, you might, right? And so if you have any of these things, so unrefreshing sleep, impaired memory or concentration, sore throat, tender lymph nodes, aching or stiff muscles, multi-joint pain. If you have it for about 6 months or so, you got to go ahead and take a look. Now, I would highly encourage you guys, if you don't wait the 6 months. If you have these symptoms, reach out to me and we'll go ahead and do a few things to improve. The first thing I like to do, after I've done, medical history is actually do tests, right? So why don't we take a look at somebody's tests and you might recognize who this individual is. It's me, right? And so what do I look at when I look at people's lab values? Well, this is the same exact panel that I give to my patients. And just to point out, I'm a cook that eats my own cooking. I get these periodically, just like I do with my patients. So what are we looking for? Well, on the basic metabolic panel, there are going to be some electrolyte deficiencies that could lead to fatigue. What are some of them? Low sodium, right? As I talked about, looking at these electrolytes, ensuring these are all within ranges, particularly sodium, is really key. If you are not eating appropriately, your glucose levels may be up. So you want to make sure that we correct them. We typically do that by utilizing metformin or by reducing carbohydrate loads. If you're dehydrated, you're going to look at your BO to creatinine ratio, and that's going to be a little bit high. Remember, it's really important to stay hydrated. Great way to tell if you're well hydrated is to make sure that your urine is clear, right, when you're going to the bathroom. Or just light yellow. If it's concentrated, very yellow, you're too dry. And then, I
Makes sense,
typically
yeah.
look at B12 and vitamin D. There are other vitamin markers we can look at, but these seem to be the key things. You want to make sure these are superlative. For me, I like to see them about 1,500 or so. For vitamin D, anywhere between 60 to 80. I fully admit I might have been slacking a little bit on my vitamin D. I definitely got back on track, and my latest values show that they were closer to about 80.
You see that a lot though, vitamin D deficiency, because we're all work from home and put on
Yeah,
computers and Zoom and
yeah,
so forth. And
exactly.
so does that cause like I guess low energy just by itself or
Well, so
symptoms
we
of
think it's
DP?
really secondary to its immunomodulatory effects. And also, another electrolyte that's very important for fatigue is optimizing your calcium level. It's important for muscle contraction. And vitamin D is very important for absorption of calcium. And it's really hard to get them up naturally. You need to be out in sunlight for several hours a day. Most of us don't have that opportunity. And the reality is not only do you need to be out in the sunlight, but you need to be out in the sunlight with a lot of your skin exposed. And not most of us can be out, for 6 to 8 hours in swimming trunks,
Walking
outside.
around.
That's
Yeah,
not going to work. Not going to
doesn't
be
work.
appropriate. The other aspect is to think about your hormonal levels. Now, for me, it's primarily thyroid, testosterone, estrogen, DHEA, and then for women, of course, progesterone. And if those levels are pretty optimized, that's a good check. And remember, I like to keep test levels at 9 to 1100, a little bit higher sometimes for certain individuals. More importantly, their free test levels closer to 20 to 30. As long as you can get that to where you need to be, perfect. Now, that's, of course, for men. For women, I typically try to look at their total testosterone levels, keep them between 50 to 100 nanograms per deciliter. And as long as they're within that range, they do pretty well. For estrogen, for guys, I tend to be a little more reticent about prescribing anastrozole because I've noticed, if you crush estrogen levels, that can really cause fatigue. So
Downstream effects, yeah.
I'm okay to let it trend up a little bit, maybe 50 or sometimes even 60 if they don't have any symptoms. I am more concerned if it gets very, very low. And I've sometimes seen that with, individuals taking anastrozole. They're worried about, nipple sensitivity, but they never ever experienced it. And, they suddenly sometimes feel a lot more lethargic, get some joint pain, and stopping the anastrozole can help. And you'll see that on your labs, your estrogen levels are too low. So anyway, just kind of going through the rest of these labs, looking at your lipid panel is important. If you have a poor diet, if you're eating too many foods that are high in saturated fats, if you're not avoiding gluten, this may likely turn into fatigue. So this is a super quick way to check. The numbers don't lie. If your triglycerides are up, if your LDL, apolipoprotein's up, yeah, we try to turn it around.
We're talking about the micronutrient test we're R&Ding, we're researching,
Yeah, that's true.
testing out that. And is that going to help, I guess, with regard to testing out clients like food insensitivities? Because some people can't digest certain proteins and then they can't absorb it as well. So I think that adds more granularity to if they actually do have certain, right, the micronutrient.
Absolutely. I tend to kind of paint with a broad brush when it comes to diet because I just use like the 20-80 rule. Try to pick the 20% of the foods that are going to lead to the 80% results in terms of decreased fatigue, decreased inflammation,
Right,
decreased risk of chronic illnesses. But the reality is we can certainly get more granular. And I'm kind of excited to roll those out in the next upcoming weeks. So, maybe we'll do a little bit better with egg white protein versus whey protein, or maybe,
yeah.
sweet potatoes aren't as good as for you, or you don't seem to tolerate them as well as rice, right? So yeah, those are things things that seem kind of interesting. The other things that outside of hormones, you also kind of want to look at your iron levels. You want to look, and why is that? Well, low iron levels can be associated with fatigue, but so can high iron levels, right? And that is something that I sometimes dealt with. I don't tend to eat a lot of heme containing foods. I don't eat a lot of red meat. And so I have to kind of watch my iron levels carefully and sometimes supplement with them periodically.
Is it too low and too bad, right?
Yeah, you kind of got to be within a decent range. If you get below, I would say about 30 or so for guys, I would definitely start supplementing. And you don't want it to be too high. If you get above 100, there's a process called ferroptosis, in which high iron levels can lead to increased inflammation and cell death, which obviously can lead to fatigue, right?
Right,
And so you don't want them too high either. And then the other labs are more or less related to your diet. So obviously, if your hemoglobin A1C is high, you're not eating a decent diet, your insulin sensitivity isn't good, and that can certainly lead to fatigue. If your homocysteine levels are high, you're not methylating appropriately.
What is the
Staying away from
methylation process again, Dr. Ryan? The
yeah.
DNA, like the conversion, or
So, well, the way I define it is it's our body's way of removing substances that are inherently toxic to us. And by adding a methyl group to many different compounds, we're able to excrete them in our common bile duct into our waste. And if you're not doing a great job, if you're not methylating things appropriately, you'll tend to accumulate homocysteine, which is kind of the canary in the coal
waste.
mine.
Oh, I see.
Exactly.
So as you age, that kind of your body's methylation kind of slows down, right?
And it gives us an idea of methylation as a whole too, not just in the liver, right? And so methylation, as you alluded to, is important for many aspects, including DNA repair, right? And that's why there's a lot of research being done on poor methylation and activation of certain genes, oncogenes, which are associated with cancer. And so that's something you wanna definitely optimize as well. And between 6 to 8 is where I like to keep it. And then finally, the last thing I like to look at is magnesium levels. Having appropriate magnesium levels are key for sleep, right? If they're too low, oftentimes we'll see patients complain of things like restless leg syndrome or just difficulty getting to sleep. And obviously, if you're not sleeping appropriately, that's going to contribute to fatigue, because you're not, getting an appropriate amount of deep sleep.
Well, Dr. Ryan, I have to pause on a second. So this is one of my clients. The client just came in today. He was talking about how he uses NyQuil. Wait, what's your view on that? Like, that's how he sleeps, right? He got off
well,
sleeping
so
meds, and he drinks like 2 shots of NyQuil.
Yeah.
And I didn't have an
Well,
answer for that. I've heard of that. I've heard of like NyQuil, and then they do something called ZZ-Quil. But is that this
so the
best
biggest
thing long term? There's a lot of artificial
no, because you're using a
preservatives
lot
in
of you're
NyQuil,
using a lot of
sucralose,
antihistamines typically.
yeah.
In long term, it will decrease the onset of sleep, right? You'll basically get to sleep quicker, but the quality of your sleep, much like with alcohol or much like with marijuana in certain cases, the onset is quicker, so you'll get to sleep quicker. But the quality of your sleep, the amount of deep sleep that you get, the amount of stage 4 sleep, of REM sleep that you get is typically reduced. So, labs are really key. And one thing I will, encourage patients to do is reach out to us. You get scheduled labs every 4 to 5 months or so. But if there is an issue, if there is a problem, reach out to us, because we want to make sure that you guys are doing great. And we'll do a set of labs in between to help diagnose issues. We kind of talked about the diagnosis, the testing. What about interventions to actually improve fatigue? And as I kind of alluded to, a lot of them will be centered around your lab values and your symptoms, right? First of all, just start with your diet. As you mentioned, JD, we're going to have a more granular approach with some of the more specific testing that will be coming out in the next coming weeks. But in general, the following advice works well. No gluten, no dairy, no nightshade vegetables. Try to avoid saturated fats. And why do we do this? Because we found that saturated fats, in particular fats from animals, tend to be correlated with higher levels of inflammation. And then when you're utilizing fats, try to avoid ones that are high in omega-6 fatty acids. And these would be things like refined seed oils like canola oil or safflower oil or corn oil. Instead, use things that are higher in omega-3 fatty acids. So like fish oil, or my favorite, which is organic flaxseed oil. Or you can potentially use macadamia nut oil, or just use the nuts themselves. Organic almonds, organic walnuts, organic macadamia
There's
nuts,
a
organic
lot. Yeah.
peanuts. Other things, these are kind of more obvious, like lifestyle interventions, like trying to limit alcohol usage or smoking. If you're smoking, just try to. It's something that it's widely known is not good long term in terms of many chronic illnesses, high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, many things, cancer, obviously. So trying to quit is a key thing. And then other things that may not be quite as obvious. So like limiting your exposure to certain environmental toxins. So a lot of us aren't aware of this, but if you have plumbing leaks, you might be exposed to mercury or lead in your water. So getting a good filtering system. I've installed a central filtering system in my house just to be on the safe side, and actually have extra filters in all of my faucets, particularly the ones I try to drink water from, just to ensure that I limit my exposure to heavy metals. And I encourage everyone to do that if you can. And then, be really careful about moldy surfaces, right? Shag carpeting is nice to walk on, but if you spill stuff on it, it gets into the undersurface, and that stuff can get moldy. So just be really careful of that. Maybe just do a deep clean every so often. Don't try to paint over moldy surfaces. I know it's probably the easy thing to do, but clean it up, dry the surfaces. And then if you are using an humidifier, which a lot of us sometimes will have to use, particularly as it gets colder and it gets really dry, don't try to go much higher than 46%, because if you go to higher than 60% humidity, you really run the risk of mold production. And which that kind of also leads into ventilation. So just getting like filters for your house can be, which can help with reducing dust or solvents that you might be allergic to. That would be a great idea. I have a air purifier in my office, and that seems to help me quite a bit.
Yeah, that.
And then just kind of round out everything. So those are some of the interventions you can do in terms of your diet as well as your lifestyle. But what about the actual therapies? Well, they're going to really be directed around your labs. So just generally, supplements. Honestly, just a really simple answer would be the VitaPack. The VitaPack has a B complex vitamin in it, magnesium, vitamin D. The multivitamin has many of the other antioxidants, vitamin C, vitamin E, you have fish oil there. I made it on purpose, kind of as a cure-all for many of the deficiencies I see in patients. So just taking it by itself is likely to improve a lot of the most common causes of fatigue. So just get on it, or at the very least, focus on getting a good multivitamin, vitamin B complex, vitamin D, and vitamin K. If you can get at least those four guys, you're doing really good. For mitochondrial health, we all know about NAD, but what about L-carnitine and coenzyme Q10? I'm a huge fan of L-carnitine, especially the injectable form, also for aesthetic reasons, right? Because it really helps with fat loss. And then, of course, hormonal optimization. And, this is something that's kind of at the forefront for the clinic, but making sure your thyroid levels, your DHA levels, progesterone, estrogen, pregnenolone are all optimized. And they will be, because we'll check in, we'll look at them.